So let us sink our teeth into Exodus and how can we prove the historical reality of this part of the Bible? Because it is foundational to the entire mythos of Judeo-Christianity and the promise of the one true religion coming out of Judea. It has to be true for all of that to hold together, or else you're on very shaky foundations for pretty much every claim that comes afterwards. Ben Shapiro and Joel Berry are telling us that Western civilization starts at this moment. Well, did this moment happen? How do we verify it? This is the moment where Moses is in Egypt and he goes on an exodus. He takes a group of Israelites who are enslaved by the evil Pharaoh and he moves them through the desert of Sinai, upon which he gets the revelation with the 10 Commandments, brings it down to the Israelites and says, we're going to follow this religion now, put down the golden calf, get rid of all this nonsense. And then they go into the promised land and they wage a conquest with Joshua where they take the promised land for themselves. This establishes Israel as the root, and they set up the first temple and worship God in their little colony. The impossible propositions, which are a gift to all people, are revealed to the chosen treasured people and then established in this world with a state and a temple. Well, this is where we introduce our scholars. We're going to go through a lot of different scholars today that take many different positions. For Exodus, we're going to deal with people who are moderate or maximalist. They believe most of the Bible, or at least some of it. The crazier ideas about the Greek origin of the Bible, this would be the minimalists. We will deal with this later. Now, I don't think any of these scholars would enjoy being called any of these labels. Nobody likes being a label, but this is just a general set of categories for us plebs to understand this very complicated intellectual bickering. So we have Russell Gmirkin and Jotan Adler. They will come later. They are the very fancy stuff. They're the wild stuff. The stuff that really gets your noggin clocking. But now we're going to deal with William Dever, Israel Finkelstein, who are more moderate, and Kenneth Kitchen, who believes that the Bible is pretty much entirely literal. Now, what you notice when we dive into this is that this knowledge is tied to people's most intimate identity, people's relationship with truth and God and death, and people's relationship with purpose and meaning, and also integration within a community. If you go into your evangelical church and you'll be like, wow, I just figured out the Bible's wrong. You're not going to be able to get a girlfriend and get married. You're going to get ostracized and people are going to treat you weird. The incentive for you is to lie. If you're Jordan Peterson, you've built your entire career on promoting a Bible, are you going to show up next week and be like, actually, I have some doubts about this? Your mind will not permit you to perceive the truth if it threatens the way you operate your life. We'll get into the neuroscience of this later in more depth, but this is foundational. The part of your mind that seems to connect to collective and religious identity, the posterior medial frontal cortex, is also the part of your mind that progenerates cognitive dissonance. And that's a big problem. Because truth and life are at war in your own head, and it's all tied to God and community. That's a big issue. William Dever and Kenneth Kitchen, these men who are more convinced that the Bible's generally true, they are both from evangelical Christian backgrounds or heavily Christian backgrounds. And watching how they deal with the knowledge tells an awful lot. William Dever basically followed the archaeology and over time describes this painful experience of his identity getting destroyed and him abandoning the faith. He began to say, well, there's no persuasive way to say that Exodus happened. It did not happen. It's not true. And he couldn't reconcile this with the beliefs of the evangelical community. So he converted to Judaism. And then when he was in Judaism, he was doing this because at least it gave him some sort of identity or connection, and then he said, no, this sucks, I don't like this either, so he became a secular atheist. Now, while he was doing that, the evangelicals all called him a lost soul. He abandoned evangelical, various things like this. And Kenneth Kitchen, who was quite popular among the evangelicals, he basically runs with the idea that the evidence has not disproven enough yet. So I'm going to take the biblical narratives on faith until we have negating evidence, absolute evidence that says, no, this definitely did not happen. So Dever will accuse Kitchen of not embracing objective truth, refusing to look at the evidence with clear eyes and standing in his own bias. And Kenneth Kitchen will accuse Dever of being a nihilistic atheist who is reducing everything down to pure archaeological evidence and not allowing the romance of the story to seduce you. Now, it's important to understand this because this bias exists in you. How can we even approach the truth if we don't look at our souls, our psychology, our neuroscience, to understand how much that gets in the way of our ability to even interface with the truth and evidence? Perhaps me, the presenter here, maybe I'm too biased towards Dever's archaeology focus, and I'll explain why in a moment. Maybe I'm not allowing myself to get seduced by the majesty of the story. Or maybe the majesty of the story is a perfect tool of seduction that blinds you, switches on your cognitive dissonance, and stops you seeing reality. And I know many of you out there will chimp because of this. Maybe you're Jewish. Maybe you're a Christian who recently converted. And you will say to yourself, all right, well, I don't want this to be true. I don't want the negation of Exodus to happen. So you will twist and distort. You'll refuse to look with clear eyes. And that is a big problem. You should try catch yourself doing this. Can you inspect your soul in this way? And maybe there will be atheists, pagans who are like, well, let's shut out. Let's get those Jews. Let's get those Christians. Let's shove it in their face that this is wrong. And that could cloud our judgment as well. We extrapolate too much out of too little evidence. We must always be on guard for this. And this is a very difficult thing to be on guard for. It's so intimately wrapped up with cognitive dissonance and our identities that it's almost impossible to pursue the truth. And you might say, Steph, why are you chutting out about truth so much? Get to the information. But I'm trying to tell the story right, because this is actually an incredible quest for the truth. What has the Bible been to us for the last 2,000 years? It has proposed itself as the truth in and of itself. And we've taken it for granted that that is what it was. And even people like Nietzsche would say that this had actually a profound disciplining effect upon the European mind. We read the good book, think of it as the truth, and we learn to inspect this truth, which creates focus inside of us, scribal intensity, which evolves into this unified science of Europe. But for 2,000 years, our approach to this truth has been very limited to the scriptures, to the word, to the realm of the spirit, which is very much what defined this religious age. This obsession with words and concepts and ideas. And if you doubted these ideas, you were told, first of all, theologically, that you're going against faith. And number two, politically, they would probably burn you at the stake. They would not take dissent lightly. But during the Enlightenment, we began to wrestle off this narrow thinking, and we opened up other perspectives to truth. We began reading Greek authors and historical authors and cross-examining the claims in the Bible. And this burst open the perspective taking that led to the first doubts in biblical accuracy. We have people like Ernst Renan in the 19th century who goes on to say that, okay, listen, after cross-examining a lot of different stuff, I don't think Jesus was God. I think he was a man who was very much present in a political situation and time, and he psychologizes Jesus. Nietzsche, for example, read Renan and extended this psychological thinking. But we're still trapped in the realm of words and your psychological take, your hot take, and what you think is going on inside people's heads. And this can be precise and accurate and intuitive, but it is limited. It is very prone to bias. You're going off hearsay. Is there better evidence that we can ascertain? And of course, in the 20th century, we got it. The arrival of archaeology. This is materialism. We came out of the world of the spirit and we went down into the quiet world of matter, which seemed to contain no information to our ancestors who would just look at it and, maybe say, well, what can we really know about this? To the arrival of our penetrating specific science that can extract incredible amounts of information from very, very little things, like looking at a log, carbon dating it, and then being able to get a vaguely precise date. Been able to find artifacts, gather them all, and be very precise and construct a picture. Having the sophisticated societies capable of maintaining this, supporting archaeologists. This is a huge step forward, which allows us to vastly contend with the knowledge within the books. And archaeology gives us completely different forms of knowledge, because archaeology can't lie to us. Words can lie. Mud can't. Or maybe it just doesn't want to. pottery, burns, that will tell us the reality. And we can use precision to map things out much, much better. So archaeology can also call out the truth, call out the spirit, the words, the books. And deeper still, as we've gotten more into the 21st century, we've gone through the human genome revolution. Thank you, Barack Obama, for pioneering this. And this has allowed us to look into our cells and discover information hidden in our flesh. Do you think our ancients understood that there was like magic code inside our muscles? Well, all flesh contains this. And if we find bodies, which we found loads from these areas back in the dating of the biblical stories, we will be able to unearth information about the people themselves, their DNA. And we can construct stories out of this. Matter is revealing to us information that the spirit could never tell us. And this allows us to challenge the spirit heavily. Now, what I would like to contribute in this is some neuroscientific principles, because we see the likes of Nietzsche, Renan, they speculate psychological ideas and intuitively are accurate, as I said. But I even like neuroscience because this is almost like a deeper, mechanistic way of understanding our psychology. It grounds it in substructures in our brains. So it should be precise. And if neuroscience is in any way useful, it should be able to explain or at least show us some of these mechanisms that might be going on. And this is what we'll get into. The neuroscience of God, perhaps, is coming up soon. So now you see why we are gaining a higher resolution picture as we go further into the 20th and 21st century. We are unlocking different modes of knowledge that are enhancing the amount of perspectives that we have, which inevitably lead to us having higher resolution pictures. And this is why we're turning to archaeologists, because there's a lot of people out there who believe based on historicism, reading books, reading history and putting it all together, but your cognitive dissonance is going to bend history to flatter your own soul. Things like archaeology is obnoxious. It shoves stuff in your face that you don't want to hear. Materialism is brute, but it is foundational and true. It is our European natural science that is giving us this ability for better penetrating depth. And the genetics are only brand new. And a lot of this is cutting edge. So this is why we're turning to the archaeologists to see what they say. How can their materialistic work fact check what we're being told about the Bible? What does it reveal? So the archaeologists claim that there's 3 parts of the Exodus narrative that we should be able to reliably test in order to confirm if it happened or not. The first would be the journey out of Egypt through Sinai in the desert. The second would be the arrival of these Israelites and their conquest of the promised land, which would show cities burnt to the ground as they took over. And the last would be the evidence of a shift in the population as this new set of Israelites showed up and took over. And the star of this section of the show are the ancient Egyptians, because the ancient Egyptians were a military state. And like all big chimps, their concern is monitoring their territory and making sure that no other little groups are going to rise up and try to fight them. So they constantly scan all across their reality to try to find people. They make mention of people. Now from this we gain one mention of what looks to be the Israelites in the Levant about 1,000 years before Christ. This still suggests that there was an Israelite people in this area, but they weren't a state, but they were a tribe. Now the next very good piece of evidence is that there is a group of people from the Levant, from the Promised Land, modern-day Israel, that go from there over into Egypt. And these people are named the Hyksos. These guys took over the city of Avaris and ruled from there. They brought in chariots and bronze weapons, and the Egyptians had to run up and kick them out after a while. Now these Hyksos, these lads are a great candidate to be the main character. They have great main character energy. They have great riz. They have great aura. We have images of them, and they all have mushroom haircuts. They're like Looney Tunes Zoomers. They're absolute mad lads, coming in here looksmacks with these very manicured haircuts on with bronze weapons and chariots, dominating these Egyptians, bringing the true religion, putting down these, heathens that are all around them and establishing their fortress in the north and conquering from there. Now, throughout history, people have said that these Hyksos were obviously the Israelites. These were the people that went into Egypt. This is great, but there's a lot of problems. One, these people were conquerors, bringing in new technology and overcoming Egypt. They were not slaves who were subjugated. And this is where Deuteronomy begins to betray itself a bit, because what the story in the Bible says is that Moses is living under Pharaoh Ramses. And Ramses, we know, was in the 13th century BC, meaning that we're a couple of centuries away from when the Hyksos even left. Now, maybe Moses and all these guys are leftovers, but now what we're seeing is the chronology is all breaking down. We're having serious issues here. Now, more maximalists like Kenneth Kitchen grab onto this, but specifically lean heavy on the stories. They're very historically based. And we do know that the Egyptians at this point said, oh yeah, we had slaves working on building various cities around Egypt at this time, like Ramses cities, which is mentioned in the Bible. And so this all nicely fits. But if we're trying to put this together with what archaeology we have, like for example the Hyksos, it just doesn't really connect. So there's a lot of sloppiness going on here. That's a bit of a frustration. And this is what leads us to the big tension point, the big question. All right, do we have proof of an exodus out of Egypt through Sinai? Because that is what would tell us that this story is real. Is there any archaeological proof? And there should be. Because the claim in the Bible is 600,000 to 2 million people moved through this desert. And if that was the case, they would leave stuff behind. There are these tribes called the Bedouin tribes in Sinai that leave artifacts, and they're tiny. Now, if there was this many people, an entire nation, and then they went and conquered this promised land, it would show. There would be stuff littered everywhere. These Hyksos, we have loads of artifacts from them. And they don't worship Yahweh, they worship Baal, they eat pork. And this is really what rocked William Dever's mind. Because he said, right, I'm going to do excavations in Sinai. I'm going to go there, I'm going to map it out, and we're going to find places where we would find Moses. And look, and we're going to search as deeply as we can. And this place has been studied a lot, and they just cannot find anything. There is no evidence of a movement through Sinai. The enormity of the movement doesn't leave any evidence. Even if you reduce the size of the population to something more modest, they still don't have any evidence. We're running off the idea that Sinai could have happened, and just because we can't find something doesn't mean it's not true. And this is actually the line that Kenneth Kitchen takes, the more literist one. He says, all right, look, absence of evidence, we can deal with that. I'm going to rely on the history until proven otherwise. This is absence of evidence. This is nothing important. But William Dever points out that this negation is enormous because it cuts the root of the most important story in history. If there was no Sinai, there was no Moses, no revelation of the Ten Commandments, no covenant to the promised chosen people. And therefore, how can these religions even stand? And this is what blackpilled Dever. Dever went there and looked. He searched. He dug stuff up. He came out empty-handed. Now, this narrow point of evidence is quite damning, but it doesn't make much sense until you put it together with the whole picture. When you look at the problems with the Joshua conquest and, of course, the genetics we have on the Israelite people themselves. This is where you really begin to fill in the perspective that takes the scholarly position that is considered consensus. There was no Exodus. There was no Moses. The people of Israel emerged out of the Levant, out of local tribes following a pagan religion, and they did not come in as conquerors. There was no Joshua conquest, and there was no Exodus traveling out of Egypt. This is not what happened.
But I think the majority of the ancestors of ancient Israel and Judah had never been in Egypt. They were essentially Canaanites, displaced both geographically and ideologically. The point is, if there was no conquest by an Exodus group, there was no Exodus group. And if there was no Exodus group, there was no Exodus.
Now, the Hyksos anomaly, where you have a Semitic people conquering a part of Egypt, Dever and many other writers basically say that this was obviously a true event, but what happened much later in history is the scribes of Judea would look back at their people and their pagan myths, which would vaguely remember this conquest. We once went in and took a portion of Egypt, and then we returned perhaps. And they might say to themselves, all right, well, let's spin this into a practical foundation myth. And they turn this into Deuteronomy. So there's not reality to Deuteronomy of a large nation moving across the desert. It's a misremembering, a bending, a using of ancient memory and transforming it into something new. Meaning that Moses, Deuteronomy, the chosen people, the Ten Commandments may have been constructed later for political reasons. And this is what leads us into Israel Finkelstein, who is much more comfortable embracing this idea that scribes would bend and use history in order to suit themselves in political situations. He is a bit more controversial than Dever, and they often argue against each other. But Finkelstein is also an archaeologist who's done many digs himself and has discovered some key evidence. And he will help us clear up the other part of the Exodus story, where there is a conquest by Joshua which apparently brings in the people of Israel. Now, Israel Finkelstein did a lot of archaeological work in the hills around Jerusalem to try figure out when exactly these Israelites come in or arrive, and instead he figured out that they emerge out of these hills. They're farmers, pastoralists with sheep, with goats, and they're following their pagan religion, and they kind of just gradually evolve into more sophisticated states. There's no massive inflow of an invading Israeli force. Instead, the people of Israel are the people of Canaan. They're not oppositional forces. There's no replacement. There's no conquest. None of that happens. And he made this prediction. He got a bit of heat for this, but genetics came in and actually confirmed what he said in 2020. We have 73 bodies from this area, which appear over the course of the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, so a large span of time. And scientists genetically tested these bodies to see, was there a massive change? Was there an arrival of 2 million people that changed the genome, which is exactly what you would expect? And instead, none of that happens. You just see this smooth, consistent transition, and everybody in Canaan remaining remarkably similar to each other all throughout a 1,000-year period when Exodus and Joshua's conquest apparently happens. Israel Finkelstein was vindicated. This is brutal, and it cuts the legs out from beneath the Joshua conquest. And this is something that people resisted because initially there were archaeological discoveries that seemed to confirm the Joshua. When the Zionists initially seized Israel in the 1940s, they began to do some archaeological digs because they wanted to discover what was the truth. And they actually found one of the cities mentioned in Joshua's conquest, Hazor, and they discovered that it had been eviscerated in flames. It had been burned to pieces at some point, destroyed, which is exactly what Joshua did in the Bible. And this was great. This showed proof of concept. The history is real. We were conquerors before, and we're back. But over time, as they excavated the other cities mentioned, because remember, there's a lot of cities that get torched by Joshua, they discovered that it probably didn't happen. In fact, a lot of these cities, sometimes they don't exist, they're unoccupied, or they're untouched during this period. And this becomes a major issue. The most famous, of course, is Jericho. They discovered that Jericho is just not really, there was no conquest there at all. It might not even have had the walls that apparently were pulled down by Joshua. And actually, of something like 14, 15 sites that apparently Joshua conquered, only 2 of them showed any evidence of a destruction, which further makes us think, why should we assume that it was the Israelites who did this? There was also a large invasion taking place at this time from, for example, the Sea People. This happened the same time, apparently, these Israelites come in. So why are we assuming that it was the Israelites when it doesn't match the story? So as archaeology has rolled forward in the 20th century, even up to the gene studies we're seeing in our time, there has been actually a breakdown of this myth. People have become less convinced as time has gone forward. And people like Israel Finkelstein put their neck out and be like, yeah, I don't think it happened quite that way. And they get heat. In fact, William Dever once called Finkelstein a post-Zionist, which is quite fascinating because what is Finkelstein doing? He is an Israeli Jew. He works out of Tel Aviv and he's subverting the mythos of the conquering Zionist promised land. Now, Finkelstein is quite interesting because he is trying to present himself as a secular Enlightenment atheist, a proper European scientist. And maybe personally he has his beliefs about God, but he's trying to do the science the correct way, to follow the evidence to the letter. And people give him heat for this. They say he's a bad Jew. He's not protecting the aura of the Zionist project. And he's getting grilled by an evangelical American for this. And this is how serious this topic is. The truth causes pain. It hurts. It hits on tender points. It creates identity crises. It is related to our spirituality. In fact, it's the foundation of our belief in God and the future and our hope for the world. And if you take that away from people, it causes problems. The Zionist political project from Finkelstein's own people hinges on this idea that this is their promised land. And to pull that away, to use archaeology to undermine this is very dangerous, especially now that they're in a war. And so we have this crisis of conscience where we want to tell the truth, perhaps, be a good scientist, but that might involve us going against identity, going against political pragmatism, going against the needs of life itself.
So this is not history in the simple sense. And the case of Jericho applies also for other places mentioned in the tradition of the conquest in the book of Joshua. Many of the cities mentioned were not inhabited at all in the late Bronze Age. There was nothing there.
So in summary, we've always had to take writings and words on face value because we've had no other good avenues for knowledge. As we've fallen into the materialist age, we've opened up archaeology, and as that has progressed, we've gained genetics in recent years. This has given us a much broader perspective and has allowed us to contrast and fact-check the stories. And most of the moderate archaeologists say to us that the foundation of the Exodus myth, which is the foundation of the biblical idea of God giving a true religion to Moses, doesn't seem to hold much water. There was no conquest of the promised land by Joshua. There was no wandering through the desert in Sinai. There were interesting anomalies like a Hyksos group, which probably is loosely the basis of these stories. And the Israelites, the Jews, do come out of the promised land, out of Canaan. They emerge out of it, not as conquerors, but out of local tribes.